Prepare to delve into the depths of antiquity, where myths intertwine with history, and every stone holds the whispers of long-past eras. We will embark on a slow and gentle journey through ancient Greek mythology and the quiet corners of history, almost forgotten by time. These stories unfolded in marble temples on dusty roads, and by the soft glow of olive oil lamps thousands of years ago, waiting for the moment they would be rediscovered. Imagine, dim the lights, settle under a blanket, and let the day's noise fade. Perhaps you're watching the sunrise paint the Tokyo sky, or maybe you're enjoying a quiet evening in London. Now, with the world around you hushed, dim the lights even further. Perhaps turn on a fan for a soft, lulling background hum, and let us allow ourselves to be transported to ancient Greece, where gods walked among mortals, and every stone could tell a tale full of mysteries and astonishing revelations. Do you know that morning when you wake up with such a pounding headache that it feels like something is about to burst from your skull? Well, imagine you are Zeus, the all-powerful king of all gods, facing precisely that agonizing problem. Except in his case something truly did burst forth, and that something wasn't just a goddess, but a fully formed, armor-clad warrior, spear at the ready, and with what would become the sharpest mind on Mount Olympus. But to understand the full depth of this incredible birth, we'll have to step back a little, for this story begins long before Zeus's famous headache. This tale doesn't start with sudden, agonizing pain, but with an ancient prophecy that kept Zeus awake at night. You see, Zeus, whose heart was as unpredictable as his thunderstorms, fell in love with Metis, a titaness whose name literally meant wisdom, or cunning intelligence. She was not only exceptionally beautiful, but, far more importantly, possessed a mind capable of outwitting anyone, even Zeus himself, though he would never admit it aloud. Picture Metis for a moment. She wasn't one to idly lounge on clouds all day, thoughtlessly consuming ambrosia. No, her mind was always at work, constantly pondering new ideas, always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. When other gods were locked in furious argument, Metis would quietly find a solution while they were still shouting and bickering. She had a characteristic way of tilting her head slightly when deep in thought, her eyes taking on a distant, perceptive look, as if she saw possibilities others couldn't even imagine. Zeus was utterly captivated. Here was someone who could match his power with her intellect, someone who could help him rule more wisely and justly. They married, and for a time, their union seemed ideal. Metis offered Zeus counsel on the most difficult decision, helping him navigate the complex politics of divine governance. She had such a subtle and gentle way of suggesting solutions that Zeus often thought they were his own ideas. It was quite clever and cunning, really. But then came the prophecy. You know how prophecies work in Greek myths. They never bring good news, and they're almost impossible to avoid. This one was particularly unsettling and ominous. It foretold that Metis would bear 2 children. First, a daughter who would be as wise as Zeus himself, and then a son who would be even more powerful and would ultimately overthrow his father. Zeus had some experience with this father-overthrowing son business. After all, he had done precisely that to his own father, Kronos, who, in turn, had done the same to his father before him. It was a truly dysfunctional family tradition that Zeus definitely did not want to continue, fearing a repeat of his ancestors' fate. So Zeus did what seemed logical and necessary at the time, though in hindsight, it was quite terrible and treacherous. He tricked Métis into transforming into a fly, and then he swallowed her whole, just like that, without hesitation. One moment she was there, offering wise counsel and gentle smiles, and the next, she was gone, dissolved into Zeus's divine essence, consumed by him. You might think that's the end of the story, but divine pregnancies don't quite work like mortal ones, and fate was already set. Métis was already carrying her daughter when Zeus swallowed her, and this little future goddess continued to grow inside Zeus's head, quite literally within his skull, preparing for her incredible emergence. For several months, Zeus suffered from increasingly severe and agonizing headaches. Imagine trying to rule the heavens and earth while feeling someone hammering inside your skull, as if trying to break out. He tried everything, divine remedies, magical healing, even meditation, but nothing helped. The pain only intensified, becoming unbearable. The other gods began to notice Zeus had changed. He snapped at them during assemblies, lost his train of thought mid-sentence, and stared into the distance, pressing his hands to his temples in an attempt to alleviate the suffering. Hera, his wife, was particularly concerned, though she probably already suspected he was in some new trouble, as she was usually not wrong about such things. Finally, when the pain became utterly unbearable, Zeus, seeing no other option, called Hephaestus, the god of smithing and crafts. Hephaestus was used to unusual and sometimes mad requests from his fellow gods, but this one was definitely strange, even by divine standards. "I need you to cleave my head open," Zeus said, probably not as calmly and indifferently as it sounds. Hephaestus, being a practical and sensible god, asked the obvious questions. Why? How? Are you absolutely sure about this insane plan? But Zeus at this point was beyond rational conversation, his mind clouded by pain. The pressure in his skull felt as though it could split Olympus itself. And so Hephaestus, with meticulous precision and skill, raised his axe. It was a beautiful weapon, perfectly balanced and sharp enough to cleave divine flesh. The other gods gathered to watch this incredible spectacle, probably keeping a safe distance in case the whole plan went horribly wrong. The axe descended with a sound like thunder cleaving the sky, and from Zeus's head emerged Athena, a sight that would forever change Olympus. But here's what's always missed in the dramatic retellings of this legendary story. She didn't just pop out and immediately start dispensing strategic advice. For the first few moments she stood there, blinking in the bright light of Olympus, probably as surprised by her appearance as all the other gods. Imagine being born fully adult, with no childhood memories, no gradual learning, just sudden existence with a complete understanding of the world. She was in armor, yes, but it wasn't flashy or ornate. It was practical, well-made, the kind of protection chosen by someone who truly understood warfare and strategy. Her spear was not a ceremonial weapon meant for parades. It was balanced for real use in combat. And her helmet, when she removed it, revealed hair already touched with the silver of wisdom, though she was entirely new to this world. The first thing she did was survey all the gods staring at her in amazement. Then her gaze fell on Zeus, who was rubbing his head with relief, freed from the agonizing pain. She could probably feel the lingering presence of her mother, Métis, somehow a part of her, in a way that would take years to fully comprehend this profound connection. Well, she might have said in that calm, measured voice that would become so familiar to heroes and supplicants throughout the ages. This is interesting. Zeus, meanwhile, felt the deepest relief of his immortal life. The headache was gone, replaced by a strange sense of pride. Here was his daughter, clearly intelligent, obviously capable, and somehow he just knew she would never be a threat to his rule. Moreover, she would become his greatest ally. And he was right. Athena became known as Zeus's favorite child, the one he trusted most. She never married, never had children who might threaten the established order. Instead, she became the goddess of wisdom, strategic warfare, and all crafts requiring both intellect and skill. But sometimes in quiet moments between her many duties, Athena would gently touch her temple, as if remembering something she had never actually experienced. Her mother Metis's wisdom lived within her, along with all those carefully crafted plans and quiet thoughts that were stifled too soon. What do you think it's like to be born with someone else's memories, with someone else's wisdom flowing in your consciousness like a gentle stream? To carry the love and knowledge of a parent you never actually met, but who was somehow a part of you in the most literal sense? It's a question to ponder for centuries. The goddess we've just met, Athena, needed temples built in her honor, and someone had to do the actual work of carving and setting those massive stones. While poets sang of heroes and gods, there were other hands, calloused, skilled, patient hands that shaped the marble and limestone destined to stand for thousands of years. You've likely seen pictures of the Parthenon, that magnificent temple crowning the Athenian Acropolis. But have you ever considered the man who spent 3 years carving a single-column capital, working with tools that would seem incredibly primitive today? His name might have been Calus or Demetrius. We'll never know for sure, but his work outlasted empires and brought us the echo of ancient times. Let's call him Alexios, because every story needs a name so we can imagine his life and labor, and imagine him waking before dawn on a cool morning in 440 BCE. The roosters are just beginning to crow in the city below the Acropolis, and the olive oil lamp in his small home flickers as he gathers his tools. Alexios has been a stonemason for 23 years, learning the trade from his father, who, in turn, learned it from his father. His hands are perpetually stained with marble dust, and there's a small scar on his left thumb from where a chisel slipped when he was still an apprentice. He is 42, making him experienced enough to work on the most crucial parts of the temple, yet still strong enough to handle the physical demands of this work that shaped the face of ancient Greece. His morning began with a simple breakfast, a slice of bread generously soaked in olive oil, a few olives, and a sip of water mixed with a little wine. His wife, Penelope, habitually handed him a lunch parcel, more bread, some cheese, and sometimes, if the season allowed, a handful of sweet figs. At dawn, she rarely spoke many words. After 18 years of marriage, they had settled into that quiet, understood routine that needed no excessive explanation. The ascent to the majestic Acropolis took him about 20 minutes, and Alexios was not alone on this daily journey. He became part of an inexhaustible stream of workers who made the same trek to the summit. Carpenters carried their tools, painters their brushes and pigments, and common labourers prepared to spend the day moving colossal marble blocks into their designated places. They exchanged silent nods along the way, These men engaged in creating something that would undoubtedly outlast each of them. By the time the sun began to rise over the eastern mountains, the construction site was already bustling. The chief architect, Iktinos, as always, arrived early, poring over his blueprints and meticulously checking measurements. This was the celebrated master whose name was destined to enter the annals of history. However, Alexios knew something that history books would never record. Iktinos relied heavily on the invaluable practical knowledge of skilled craftsmen like himself. Just the day before, Iktinos had summoned Alexios to assess a problem with one of the column drums. An unexpected vein had been discovered in the marble, and the architect wanted to know if it would affect the structural integrity of the element. Alexios ran his palms over the stone, hands that had touched thousands of marble blocks, hands that could read stone as masterfully as others read scrolls. "It will hold," he pronounced after a long, thoughtful pause. "The grain runs along the line of weight, not against it. However, we should orient this piece so the vein is at the back, away from the primary line of sight." This was knowledge accumulated over decades of painstaking labor, wisdom drawn not from scrolls or mathematical calculations, but from years of intimate work with stone, from studying its quirks and boundless possibilities. Today, Alexios was working on a section of the frieze that was to encircle the temple's inner space. This artwork depicted a solemn procession of Athenian citizens bearing gifts to the goddess Athena during the Panathenaic festival. The specific section he was working on showed a group of young men leading cattle for sacrifice, and he had already dedicated 6 weeks to this task. The process was agonizingly slow. Every chisel stroke required absolute precision, for marble forgave not the slightest error. Too aggressive an approach could chip off a fragment that should have remained untouched. Too gentle, and the work would drag on twice as long, becoming an inefficient waste of precious time. Alexios began each figure with a rough outline of the basic form using a pointed chisel, a robust tool capable of removing significant amounts of stone relatively quickly. The sound it made, a tap-tap, became almost meditative after a while, a steady rhythm marking the passage of time. Other stonemasons working nearby created their own rhythms, and together they formed a kind of percussive ensemble, their sounds echoing from the marble columns. As the morning progressed and the sun climbed higher, Alexios moved to finer tools. A flat chisel allowed him to smooth surfaces and create clear, expressive lines. Calipers helped control proportions, the distance between a figure's eyes, the width of a bull's shoulders. The ancient Greeks adhered to very specific ideas about ideal proportions, about the mathematical ratios believed to produce perfect beauty. However, Alexios understood perfectly that mathematics alone does not create true art. There was something else, something more elusive, that distinguished merely competent carving from something truly beautiful. He saw it in how his mentor, old Sophron, could make marble seem to breathe. Sophron had passed away 3 years ago, but his works were everywhere in the temple, and sometimes Alexios would pause his own labor to carefully study a section carved by Sophron, trying to comprehend precisely how the old master achieved certain effects. Around noon, when the sun was directly overhead and the heat made the marble almost too hot to touch comfortably, the workers paused for a rest. They gathered in any available patch of shade, ate their simple lunches, and shared water from large clay pitchers, which were regularly refilled by young apprentices. Conversations during these breaks rarely touched upon art or architecture. More often they concerned everyday worries, whose wife was expecting a child, where to find the best price for olive oil, whether the rumors about trouble with Sparta were serious enough to worry about. These men were not only skilled craftsmen, but also full citizens, husbands, fathers, active members of their community. Alexios sat beside Nicias, a painter who worked on the temple's interior decorations. Nicias was younger, perhaps around 28, and still genuinely enthusiastic about every aspect of the project, which Alexios found both charming and a little tiring. "Did you see the new batch of marble that arrived yesterday?" Nicias asked between bites of bread from Paros. "The quality is extraordinary, so pure you can almost see through it in thin slices." Alexios nodded. He had, of course, seen that marble. Good marble for a stonemason was certainly what good pigments were for a painter, the foundation of all subsequent creation. Parian marble indeed possessed exceptional properties, with a crystalline structure that allowed light to penetrate slightly below the surface, giving finished sculptures an almost luminous quality. "It's being saved for the cult statue," Alexios informed him. "Phidias wants to use it for Athena's face and hands." This was exciting news. Phidias was the most famous sculptor in all of Greece, and his statue of Athena was to be the centerpiece of the entire temple. Much of the statue would be gold and ivory, but the exposed areas of skin, the face, hands, feet, would be carved from this precious Parian marble. After the break, Alexios returned to his section of the frieze. The afternoon's work differed significantly from the morning's routine. The light had changed, now falling at a different angle, revealing aspects of the carving that had previously remained hidden. It was at this time that he could most clearly see how the work was progressing, where adjustments needed to be made. He labored on the face of a young man in the procession, roughly the same age as his own son. The challenge was to create a face that looked like a specific person, someone one might meet on the streets of Athens, while also embodying the ideal of youthful male beauty that the Greeks so highly valued. The eyes were particularly complex. They needed to appear alert and alive, focused on the sacred duty of the procession, yet not so specific as to distract from the overall composition. Alexios had carved hundreds of eyes over the years, and he had developed his own methods for creating subtle shadows and highlights that made the marble seem to see. As he worked, he pondered permanence. This temple was being built to last forever, or at least as close to forever as a human structure could come. Long after Alexios was gone, long after everyone now living in Athens was dead and forgotten, people would stand in this temple and look at the work he was doing today. It was a sobering and inspiring thought. The face of the young man he carved would outlive wars, political upheavals, the rise and fall of empires. In a way, Alexios was achieving a kind of immortality that no king or general could claim. His work would speak for him through the ages. But there was also something humbling in this. No one would know his name. No poet would compose songs about Alexios the stonemason. His contribution would remain anonymous, subsumed by the greater glory of Athens and its patron goddess. And somehow that felt right to him. The temple was not about individual glory. It was something larger, something that connected all Athenians to their gods and to each other. Alexios was a part of that connection, one link in a chain that stretched from the city's foundation and led into an unimaginable future. As the sun began to set behind the western hills, Casting long shadows across the Acropolis, Alexios cleaned his tools and prepared to head home. Tomorrow he would return and continue the slow, painstaking work of bringing stone to life. Day after day, chip by chip, he and his fellow craftsmen were creating something that would stand as an eternal testament to human skill and devotion. Imagine what it's like to spend your days creating something you know will outlast you by thousands of years, working in quiet anonymity on a project so grand it seemed to touch eternity itself. These craftsmen who built Athena's temple were quite hungry, and their dinner always included the same golden ingredient into which Alexios dipped his morning bread. Olive oil in ancient Athens was not just food, it was life itself, flowing through the city's economy, culture, and daily rituals like blood through veins. Let us introduce Theodorus, a skilled olive oil merchant whose extensive holdings included 3 fertile groves nestled on the picturesque slopes outside ancient Athens. He awoke long before the first rays of sun, not out of excessive greed, but because the very nature of his craft demanded such unceasing vigilance. Olive oil, this precious elixir, was incredibly delicate and particularly sensitive to the effects of heat, light, and the relentless march of time. These factors could determine the fate of his enterprise, defining the line between abundance and ruin. The olive trees carefully nurtured on Theodorus's land were truly ancient. Some, according to tradition, had been planted by his own great-grandfather's grandfather. These centuries-old giants possessed mighty, gnarled trunks and silvery green foliage that rustled melodically even with the lightest breeze. They did not reach impressive heights, for olive trees rarely do, but their power and resilience were undeniable. They seemed designed to withstand the scorching, arid summers and the mild but changeable winters of Attica. Each tree, it seemed, possessed its own unique character, discernible only to one who knew how to recognize it. Thus, the old tree by the ancient stone wall invariably yielded fruit a full week earlier than its brethren. The grove located on the eastern slope was renowned for oil with a light, piquant, peppery note, valued and ordered by specific, discerning clients. And the trees that grew by the stream, though they produced an abundant harvest, yielded oil with a softer, gentler flavor, ideal for culinary needs but less sought after for ceremonial occasions where olive oil was used in sacred religious rituals. This morning, Theodorus carefully inspected his estate, overseeing the progress of the harvest. It was late October, and the olive fruits had reached their ideal ripeness. Their skins had taken on a deep dark purple, almost black hue, and the pulp became yielding with a light press, yet still clung firmly to the branches, not falling at the slightest touch. Timing, as is well known, played a crucial role in the art of olive oil production. If the harvest was gathered too early, the oil yield would be less, and its taste harsh and bitter. If delayed, the olives could begin to ferment right on the tree, which would irrevocably spoil the entire flavor profile. His numerous workers, a motley collection including slaves, hired free men, and neighbors who helped in exchange for a share of the valuable oil, had been toiling at the harvest for 3 days. They used long, thin sticks to precisely knock olives from the branches, allowing them to fall neatly onto large cloths carefully spread beneath each tree. This work required not only diligence but also a special delicacy. Too strong a blow could damage the delicate buds that were to yield next year's crop. Too gentle a touch would not allow the ripe olives to detach from the branches. Observing the harvesting process, an outsider might notice the surprising abundance of conversation that accompanied the work. Olive picking was by no means a solitary activity. It required coordinated action between those deftly wielding the sticks and those holding the cloths ready. The natural rhythm of the labor created ideal conditions for casual conversation. Workers discussed a wide range of topics, from local politics and the latest gossip from the agora, to predictions about the coming weather and complaints about their many ailments. Among them stood out an elderly man named Cleon, who had helped Theodorus with the harvest for 15 years. He knew these trees almost as well as the owner himself, and held firm opinions on all matters concerning olive cultivation. "This new variety they're planting in Aegina," he grumbled, shaking his head as he set up a ladder to another tree, "produces too much oil, but it lacks flavor. Quantity isn't everything." Theodorus nodded distractedly. He had heard similar arguments many times before, and while he couldn't entirely disagree with them, he also perfectly understood the economic pressures that drove innovation in agriculture. Athens was growing rapidly, and the demand for olive oil seemed to increase every year. Sometimes, especially when it came to feeding an entire city, quantity truly was critical. By mid-morning, Theodorus's workers had already filled several impressive baskets with fresh olives, and it was time to transport the precious harvest to the oil press. It was here that the olive oil production process became truly fascinating and complex. Most people enjoying the golden nectar at their tables rarely considered the multi-stage transformation that turned bitter, inedible fruits into exquisite oil. The main piece of equipment in the oil press was the olive mill, a massive stone wheel designed to methodically roll over the olives, turning them into a thick, uniform paste. This wheel was powered by a mule, which monotonously walked in circles hour after hour, pausing only occasionally for short rests and a sip of water. This work was devoid of glamour but required constant attention and meticulousness. The olives had to be thoroughly crushed, but not too aggressively to avoid cracking the pits, which would inevitably impart an undesirable bitterness to the oil. Once the olives were properly crushed into a paste, it was carefully spread onto round mats, skillfully woven from strong plant fibers. These mats, filled with the fragrant paste, were then stacked on top of each other and placed under a massive wooden beam that functioned as a powerful lever press. Heavy weights were gradually added to one end of this beam, creating colossal pressure that slowly but surely squeezed the precious oil from the olive paste. The first oil that emerged from this process was considered the most valuable. It was pure, golden, with a fresh, fruity aroma that seemed to tell of generous sunlight and painstaking cultivation. This first pressing, which today could well be compared to extra virgin olive oil, sold for the highest prices in the agora. Wealthy Athenians used it to prepare exquisite dishes, and it was also absolutely indispensable for sacred religious ceremonies, where purity and impeccability were paramount. However, the oil extraction process did not end there. After the first pressing, the mats with the paste were carefully rearranged and subjected to a second pressing. This action yielded a second-grade oil, which was nevertheless considered quite suitable for most everyday culinary needs. But even at this stage, the provident approach did not end. The remaining paste could be mixed with hot water and pressed again, producing a lower quality oil, ideal for use in oil lamps and other non-culinary purposes. Theodorus took deep pride in the fact that nothing went to waste on his farm. The pulp and crushed pits remaining after pressing served as excellent fertilizer for future crops. The water used in the final pressing, though not intended for drinking, was successfully used to irrigate the olive trees during dry periods. Even the mats, when they finally wore out, were composted and returned to the fertile soil, thus completing the natural cycle. Later that day, Theodorus would begin loading amphorae, those recognizable clay vessels with characteristic narrow necks and pointed bottoms, with his best, most valuable oil, to then transport them to Athens for sale. The amphorae themselves were true works of art, crafted by experienced potters, who perfectly understood that the quality and functionality of the vessel were almost as important as its precious contents. A skillfully made amphora reliably protected the oil from the harmful effects of light and air, ensuring its freshness for many months or even several years. The journey to the city took approximately 2 hours, traversed by a cart pulled by slow oxen, along a road that had been polished and compacted by generations of similar daily trips. Theodorus knew every stone and every rut on this route, every potentially dangerous spot where the cart could get stuck in wet weather, and every scenic view that opened up a majestic panorama of the city and its vast surroundings. As Theodorus's cart approached magnificent Athens, road traffic noticeably increased. Many other farmers were also rushing to deliver their diverse produce to the bustling city market. There was wheat and barley, exquisite wine and fragrant honey, homemade cheese and fresh vegetables. The city was entirely dependent on this daily, inexhaustible influx of food from the fertile surrounding countryside, while the farmers themselves, in turn, fully relied on the constant demand from city dwellers for their harvest. It was a deeply ingrained, mutually beneficial system of relationships that functioned flawlessly, as each side acutely needed what the other could offer. Theodorus's permanent trading spot in the bustling agora was located near the southwest corner, and it was here that he had successfully sold his oil for 12 years. His many customers knew exactly where to find him, and he, in turn, had thoroughly learned their individual preferences. Thus, Aristophanes, a renowned cook, always demanded oil with a piquant, peppery taste, sourced from the grove on the eastern slope. The priestess of Demeter adamantly insisted exclusively on oil obtained from the oldest trees, claiming she perceived the subtlest difference in her ritual preparations. Today, however, he had a new visitor, a young woman who seemed somewhat bewildered and not entirely sure what she was looking for. She had probably recently married and was just beginning to learn the intricacies of household management. Theodorus, with his characteristic patience, took the time to explain the characteristics of various oils in detail and allowed her to sample small amounts directly from his finger. For cooking fish, he gently advised, you'll need something with a light pungency, something that won't get lost among richer flavors. But for fresh bread or drizzling over vegetables, you might prefer something softer, more delicate. Such education was an integral part of his work, and he found true pleasure in it. There was deep satisfaction in helping someone grasp what you yourself understood well, in transmitting knowledge that had been carefully passed down through generations between olive growers and oil producers. By the end of the day, most of his amphorae were empty, their contents sold to numerous buyers who carried the precious oil away in their smaller containers. The funds Theodorus earned were intended to purchase what his own farm could not produce: salt, iron, necessary tools, exquisite pottery, and sturdy cloth. Additionally, a portion of the proceeds provided a small but important surplus that allowed him to gradually improve his groves, planting new young trees to replace those that had finally aged and ceased to yield abundant and quality fruit. Loading the empty vessels back onto the cart for the return journey, Theodorus pondered the extraordinary miracle of his existence. These ancient trees, planted by ancestors he never personally knew, continued to provide sustenance for families he would never meet. The oil that flowed from his presses would light homes throughout Athens, nourish children yet to be born, anoint the bodies of athletes preparing for competitions, and serve as sacred offerings in temples dedicated to gods whose legends were rooted in the deepest antiquity of human memory. There was something deeply satisfying in participating in this ancient, continuous cycle. It was an eternal round, planting, careful tending, painstaking harvesting, meticulous processing, selling, and then the inevitable return to the very beginning. The olive trees, these silent witnesses to history, would outlive him, as they had outlived his father and his grandfather. The knowledge of how to transform bitter fruit into precious golden oil would be passed down to his sons, and then to their sons, continuing a centuries-old tradition. What is it like to work with something so inextricably linked to the earth and deeply rooted in human tradition, where each day of hard work connects one with millennia of accumulated wisdom? The olive oil that Theodorus had recently sold would eventually reach many tables across Athens, including the one where Philippos, a hoplite in the Athenian army, shared his evening meal with his family. However, at this moment, as dawn just broke over the mountain ranges, Philippos was 40 miles from home, carrying 60 pounds of equipment, and wondering when his weary feet would finally stop aching. Being a hoplite sounds so romantic when poets sing about it. Brave warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, their bronze armor gleaming in the sun, fighting for the glory of Athens. The reality was starkly different. Most of a hoplite's time was spent marching, and Philippos had been doing a lot of marching lately. His unit had left Athens 6 days ago, responding to reports of raiders threatening one of the city's allied settlements. As it turned out, the alarm was false. The raiders were merely a group of shepherds who had wandered further from home than usual, following their flocks. But orders were orders, and the army doesn't turn back just because a threat proved illusory. They continued on to a border fortress, where they would spend 2 weeks helping to repair fortifications and training the local militia. Philippos was 31, making him one of the middle-aged members of his unit. He had served as a hoplite for 13 years, ever since he inherited enough land to afford the necessary equipment. In Athens, military service was both a duty and a privilege. Only citizens wealthy enough to acquire their own armor and weapons were required to serve in the heavy infantry. His panoply, the full set of hoplite gear, represented a substantial investment. The bronze breastplate alone cost more than a skilled craftsman earned in 3 months. The round shield, or hoplon, from which hoplites derived their name, was made of wood covered with bronze, with a distinctive rim that could be used as a weapon in close combat. A 9-foot spear, perfectly balanced for thrusting rather than throwing, completed the arsenal. A short sword served as a backup weapon, and a bronze helmet with a distinctive crest completed this impressive ensemble. All this gear was tied to Philippos's body, or slung over his shoulders as he walked the dusty road. The weight was distributed as evenly as possible, but after 6 days of marching, every strap had found a way to leave its mark on his skin, and every piece of metal seemed to have developed its own particular way of digging into his flesh. The morning was still cool, which was a true gift. By midday, when the sun would be directly overhead, the bronze armor would become almost unbearably hot. Philippos had learned to drink water regularly throughout the day, even when not particularly thirsty, because dehydration in armor could have serious consequences. He walked beside Nicodemus, a potter who served in the same unit. They had marched together for years on various campaigns, and they had developed that easy conversation that helped pass the long hours on the road. "My wife," Nicodemus said, adjusting his shield strap for the 100th time that morning, "thinks I should ask for a garrison posting in the city, easier on the family," she says, "more predictable schedule." Philippus weighed the arguments. Garrison duty had its advantages. Most nights you slept in your own bed. You could attend to personal affairs. Your children grew up knowing who you were. But it also tended to be exceptionally monotonous and tedious. Standing guard at the city gates, escorting officials to meetings, maintaining equipment that was rarely used in actual combat. "The pay is about the same," Philippos pointed out, "but you miss out on your share of any spoils we might capture." This was a very important consideration for citizen soldiers who did not possess significant wealth. Military service was paid, but not generously, and the prospect of additional income from successful campaigns could significantly affect a family's economic situation. The column of marching hoplites stretched for almost a quarter of a mile down the road. About 400 men were on this expedition, organized into units by tribe and deme. Philippos belonged to the Antiochus tribe, and within it, he was part of a group from his local deme of Acharne. These were men he had known most of his life, neighbors, relatives, people he saw regularly in the agora or at religious festivals. This familiarity was both a strength and a complication. On one hand, hoplite warfare depended on deep mutual trust and impeccable coordination. When you stood in a phalanx, your life literally depended on the man next to you holding his position and doing his job. It was helpful to know that the man holding the shield that protected your right flank was someone you had grown up with, whose character you understood. On the other hand, personal relationships could complicate military discipline. The man, marching in front of Philippos, was his cousin Demetrius, who had a tendency to complain loudly about everything from the quality of their rations to the competence of their officers. In civilian life, this was just part of Demetrius's character, which his family tolerated with good-natured eye rolls. In military situations, it could be quite detrimental to morale. Around mid-morning, the column reached a small stream, where they were allowed a short rest. The men shed their heavy packs and immediately headed for the water, not only to drink, but also to wash their hot faces and necks. Some of the younger soldiers completely removed their bronze breastplates. But veterans like Philippos knew that the effort of getting back into armor wasn't worth the momentary relief. Instead, he found a shady spot under an olive tree and sat down carefully, mindful of the sword at his side and the spear he leaned against the trunk. From his pack, he took out a piece of dry bread and some dried figs, the standard campaign ration, which was nutritious, though not particularly appetizing. As he ate, Philippus watched the young men splashing in the stream and remembered his first campaign 15 years ago. He had been so eager to prove himself, so convinced that military service would be an endless series of glorious feats and heroic achievements. The reality of aching feet, heavy equipment, and endless marches had been a significant shock. But over the years, he had developed a different kind of appreciation for military service. There was something to be said for the clear certainty of army life. You knew what was expected of you. Your duties were clearly defined. Success and failure were usually obvious. In his civilian life, Philippus farmed the land left to him by his father, growing olives and barley and keeping a few goats. It was good work, honest work, but it was also full of uncertainties. The weather, crop diseases, fluctuating market prices, the need to maintain good relations with neighbors who could help in emergencies. All these factors could affect his family's well-being in ways largely beyond his control. Military service, in contrast, simplified existence into clearer, more unambiguous terms. Follow orders, care for your equipment, look out for your fellow soldiers, perform your duty when called to fight. There was something almost peaceful in this clarity of everything. The rest period ended too quickly, as it always does, and the column reformed to continue the march. The road ahead gradually wound into hilly terrain, covered with oak and wild grasses. The landscape was beautiful in its own way, rocky, sun-baked, dotted with small farms and shepherds' huts, but Philippos had learned to see it primarily through the lens of tactical considerations. This ridgeline would provide good cover for archers. The narrow pass ahead could be easily blocked by a small force, trapping a larger army in the valley below. The flat ground near that village would be suitable for forming a phalanx, but the rocky land to the east would favor lighter, more mobile troops. This way of seeing the landscape gradually developed in experienced soldiers. Everything became a potential battlefield. Every natural feature a possible advantage or impediment. It was not an especially peaceful way to see the world, but it was practical knowledge that had saved Philippos's life in several real battles. By the end of the day, the fortress they were heading for became visible in the distance. An unassuming cluster of stone buildings, surrounded by walls that had seen better days. This was what they would be repairing for the next 2 weeks, as well as training the local militia in basic tactics and formations. It was not the stuff of epic songs, but the work was important. The network of small forts and allied settlements surrounding Athens was part of what kept the city-states safe and prosperous. Each outpost extended Athenian influence a little further, provided a base for patrols that kept trade routes secure, and offered refuge for farmers and shepherds when raiders appeared. As they approached the fortress, Philippos saw people coming out to meet the arriving soldiers. The garrison commander, local officials, children excited by the arrival of real Athenian soldiers. There would be a brief ceremony, a few speeches about duty and service to the city, and then the immediate practical tasks of setting up camp and beginning the assigned work. Tonight he would sleep on the ground under the stars, wrapped in his cloak and using his shield as a pillow. Though uncomfortable, it had become familiar, and there was something pleasing in the simple satisfaction of finally taking off his armor and letting his feet rest. Tomorrow he would wake with new aches and begin the work of strengthening this small outpost of Athenian power. This is not what epic poetry sings about, but it is these constant, unglamorous efforts that actually keep a city-state functioning and safe, protecting it from adversity. Heavy was this burden, both literally and figuratively, the physical weight of armor and weapons, and the responsibility of protecting not only his family, but the entire community that depended on his service. Quiet service in the shadow of the gods, the daily life of the Delphic oracle. While Philippos and his comrades, true to their duty, steadily advanced toward the border fort, pilgrims from all corners of the Hellenic world undertook their own, no less significant journey. Their path led to Delphi, a place far more renowned and shrouded in mystery, where the words of Apollo himself issued from the mouth of the oracle. Yet behind the majestic prophecies and sacred rituals lay a less visible, but no less profound, story, a narrative of everyday existence in the shadow of all-powerful gods. The central figure of this world is the Pythia. This, of course, is not her real name, which was probably quite ordinary, like Cleona or Theodora. Pythia is the title she adopted upon becoming the voice of the oracle. She is 43 years old, and for 11 years she has performed this sacred service. At this moment, she is in her modest room within the temple complex, preparing for perhaps the most fateful consultation of her career. Tomorrow, envoys from Athens are expected, whose questions concern a proposed military campaign. The day after tomorrow, a delegation from Sparta will seek guidance regarding a disputed succession. And next week, a wealthy merchant from Corinth will arrive to inquire whether Apollo approves of his plan to establish a new trading colony. The stream of questions is endless, and each carries the weight of decisions capable of altering the destinies of thousands. But tonight, in the pre-dawn hour of silence, the Pythia is merely a middle-aged woman with greying hair and tired eyes, who is mentally and spiritually preparing for another day when she must become the mouth of a god. Her daily routine begins with purification rituals that remain invisible to most visitors to Delphi. She bathes in the sacred Castalian spring, whose water is so cold that even in the summer heat it makes her gasp. This sharp cold is an integral part of her preparation. It cleanses her mind and fully immerses her in her own body, making her ready for any divine inspiration that may descend. After bathing, she dons a simple white chiton, symbolizing her sacred service. No ornaments, no extravagance, nothing that could distract from her role as a pure conduit for Apollo's wisdom. Her breakfast is equally ascetic. Bread, water, perhaps a few almonds. She has long learned that prophecy comes more easily on an almost empty stomach. The oracle chamber itself is unlike any other on earth. Built over a natural fissure in the rock, it is filled with the scent of laurel leaves and the faint, sweet smell of gases seeping from deep within the earth. Modern scientists hypothesize about these gases, suggesting they might be ethylene or other natural chemical compounds capable of inducing altered states of consciousness. However, the Pythia does not think in terms of chemistry. For her, the strange sensations she experiences in the chamber are nothing less than the direct presence of the god. Her assistant, Nicomachus, is already awaiting her arrival in the temple. He is a priest who has served in Delphi for 23 years, and his role is to translate between the oracle and the outside world. The Pythia utters words bestowed upon her by Apollo, but these words are not always expressed in forms easily understood by ordinary people. Sometimes she speaks in verse, sometimes in riddles, and occasionally in languages she does not consciously know. Nicomachus has developed an outstanding skill in interpreting divine utterances into practical advice. It is delicate work. He must remain faithful to the oracle's words while making them accessible to people who have travelled hundreds of miles and spent considerable sums for the privilege of questioning Apollo. The Athenian delegation arrived late last night, he informs her as they proceed through the temple corridors. 3 generals and a representative of the assembly. They are asking about the proposed expedition to Sicily. The Pythia nods. She had anticipated this consultation. The planned Sicilian expedition is a hotly debated topic throughout the Greek world, an ambitious undertaking that could bring Athens great glory and wealth, or lead to utter collapse. It is precisely the kind of decision that mortal rulers prefer not to make without divine guidance. When they arrive, the consultation chamber is already prepared. The sacred tripod, a three-legged bronze stool stands above the rock fissure. Laurel branches, sacred to Apollo, are arranged throughout the room. An eternal fire burns steadily in its bronze brazier, as it has for centuries. The Pythia sits on the tripod and closes her eyes, allowing her breathing to slow and deepen. This is the most mysterious part of her service, the moment when she must somehow open herself to become a vessel for divine communication. After 11 years of practice, she has developed methods that help, but the process is never quite the same. Sometimes inspiration comes as words that seem to form in her mind without her conscious involvement. Sometimes it is more like images or emotions that she must somehow translate into human language. And sometimes, more often than she would like to admit, nothing happens at all, and she has to sit in silence until Apollo deigns to speak, or until it becomes clear that today is not a day for prophecy. The Athenian delegation is led by Nicias, a general she remembers from previous consultations. He is a cautious, pious man who rarely makes important decisions without divine guidance. His questions are always thoughtful, and he listens respectfully to any answers he receives. But today, there is something different in his demeanor, a tension that suggests he already fears what the oracle might tell him. As Nicomachus formally presents the question about the Sicilian expedition, the Pythia senses that Nicias hopes for a clear negative answer, permission to abandon a plan he considers dangerous. The inspiration, when it comes, is unusually clear and instantaneous. Words form in the Pythia's mind, words she speaks aloud without fully understanding their meaning. The expedition will bring great change to Athens. Many will sail but not return. The gods favor those who act justly, but justice and victory are not always the same. This is the kind of answer that oracle seekers both love and hate. It clearly relates to their question, but allows for multiple interpretations. Does it mean the expedition is favored by the gods, or is it a warning against it? The uncertainty is frustrating, but it is also honest. The future is rarely as clear as people would like it to be. Nicomachus carefully records the oracle's words, and the Athenian delegation withdraws to discuss their meaning. This is another aspect of an oracle consultation that visitors do not always anticipate. Interpreting the prophecy can be as important as the prophecy itself. Between consultations, the Pythia rests in a small garden behind the temple. It is a peaceful place, shaded by ancient olive trees and filled with the buzzing of bees toiling among the lavender and rosemary. These quiet moments are essential for maintaining her mental balance in a job that demands her constant availability to the divine. She has been Pythia long enough to see the consequences of some of her prophecies. Cities started wars or refrained from them based on her words. People made life-altering decisions thanks to guidance received in the oracle chamber. The weight of this responsibility is sometimes overwhelming, but there are also moments of genuine wonder when she feels clearly connected to something much larger than herself. Not every prophecy comes with dramatic inspiration. Many consultations involve simple requests for guidance on everyday problems, and the answers that come through her often prove surprisingly practical and helpful. A farmer wants to know the best time to plant his crops. A woman asks whether she should accept a marriage proposal. A merchant inquires about the safest route for a trading journey. These are not the consultations that make history, but they are the ones that remind the Pythia that her role, ultimately, is to help people live more wisely. As the day draws to a close, she receives visitors from Thebes, Corinth, and a small city-state in southern Italy. Each consultation follows the same pattern: formal presentation of the question, a period of inspired response, careful recording of her words, discussion of meaning and interpretation. But beneath this ritualistic structure, a more human drama unfolds. These are people facing genuine uncertainty, seeking guidance in situations where the stakes are often very high. The Pythia has learned to listen not only to their formal questions, but also to the fears and hopes that underlie those questions. The young man from Corinth, for example, asks about a business venture, but his real concern is whether he is worthy of his father's respect. An elderly woman from Thebes inquires about her grandson's education, but what she really wants to know is whether her lineage will prosper after she is gone. By evening, when the last consultation is finished and the temple complex falls silent, the Pythia is exhausted in a way that has nothing to do with physical exertion. To speak for a god, even for only a few hours a day, demands a kind of emotional and spiritual energy that is difficult to describe to people who have not experienced it. She dines alone in her quarters. Bread, cheese, olives, water mixed with a little wine. The food is especially delicious after a day of fasting and spiritual effort. As she eats, she hears the distant sound of pilgrims gathering around their campfires, discussing the guidance they received and making plans for their return journey. Tomorrow, new questions will come, new seekers, new opportunities to serve as a bridge between the human and divine worlds. The work will continue, as it has for centuries, as long as people need guidance, and Apollo chooses to provide it through mortal voices. What is it like to spend your days translating the whispers of gods into words that ordinary people could understand and use? To bear such responsibility for the most important decisions of others? The pilgrims gathered around the campfires in Delphi would awaken hungry tomorrow morning, and their meals would depend entirely on the painstaking labor of farmers like Dionysius. This farmer cultivated his lands on the fertile plain of Thessaly, far from the celebrated temples and bustling agoras that usually capture our attention when contemplating ancient Greece. Dionysius grew wheat and barley on land his family had worked for 6 generations. He was 54 years old, and his hands bore the permanent marks of earth and sun. He possessed a profound knowledge of weather conditions and soil quality, something no book could teach. Right now, on this cool early spring morning, he intently walked his fields, like a man whose family's survival depended on making absolutely correct decisions regarding planting times, quantities, and locations. This year's winter had been mild, which usually boded well for farming, but Dionysius had learned to be cautious about drawing hasty conclusions. A mild winter could signal an early spring, which, at first glance, seemed positive, but could also lead to the survival of pests that usually perished in severe frosts. Furthermore, early planting, while capable of yielding more abundant harvests, increased the risk of crop damage if late frosts occurred after the seeds had sprouted. He stopped at the edge of his largest field, crouched down, and scooped up a handful of earth. He performed this action almost instinctively, testing the soil with his fingers, searching for the optimal balance of moisture and texture that indicated ideal planting conditions. Too much moisture would cause the seeds to rot before sprouting. Excessive dryness would prevent them from sprouting at all. Today the soil seemed adequate, though not perfect. Perfect soil was more a matter of hope than reality, but it was quite suitable for the work ahead. Dionysius straightened up and called to his son, Callisthenes, who was preparing the ox-drawn plough at the opposite end of the field. Callisthenes was 22, strong from years of farm labour, and eager to take on more responsibility for the family farm. However, he was young enough to occasionally question traditional methods, which sparked interesting conversations during the long hours they spent together. "Father," he said, setting the plough in its starting position, "I spoke with Aristodemus yesterday. He plans to try a new planting method we heard about from the Egyptians. Denser spacing, intensive cultivation. He thinks it could increase yields by up to 20%. Dionysius pondered what he heard, checking the bronze ploughshare, ensuring it was properly sharpened and securely fastened. He had heard about the Egyptian methods, and in theory they did sound promising. However, theory and practice were different things, especially when it came to an unpredictable occupation like farming. "Aristodemus has good land," he finally said. "Rich soil, reliable water supply, enough slaves to do the extra work that intensive cultivation requires. Our situation is different." This was part of the continuous education every farmer was obligated to pass on to the next generation. It was not just about the technical knowledge of growing crops, but also the wisdom to understand what would and would not work in their specific circumstances. Each farm was unique, shaped by a unique combination of soil, climate, water availability, labor, and market conditions. They began ploughing, following the furrows that stretched the length of the field. The work was rhythmic, almost meditative, once they found the pace. The ox knew its duties and rarely needed guidance. Callisthenes walked beside the animal, occasionally adjusting its direction to keep the furrows straight. Dionysius followed him, using a short hoe to break up clods of earth and smooth the bottom of the furrow. As he worked, Dionysius watched the sky with the automatic vigilance of a man whose livelihood depended on the weather. The clouds today were high and thin, probably no rain, which was good for ploughing, but meant they would need to monitor soil moisture over the next few days. Too many clear days in a row, and the ground would become too hard for planting. The rhythm of the work created natural opportunities for conversation, and father and son discussed many things as they traversed the field. Family news: Callisthenes' younger sister was getting married next month, and preparations were needed. Local politics: the city assembly was debating a new tax on grain exports, which could affect their income. Technical farming questions: whether to expand the wheat acreage or plant more barley instead. Each of these conversations reflected the complex web of relationships and considerations that shaped a farmer's life. Marriage required careful planning because the harvest season was approaching, and they would need all available labor during those critical weeks. The tax debates were important because Dionysius sold some of his harvest to merchants who exported grain to other cities. The choice between wheat and barley involved balancing market prices, soil conditions, water needs, and family preferences. By midday, they had ploughed roughly half the field. This was good progress, but the work was far from over. They rested in the shade of an old oak at the edge of the field, sharing bread, cheese, and water from a clay jug that Callisthenes' mother had packed for them that morning. As they ate, Dionysius pointed out landmarks and features of their land that told the story of many years of careful cultivation. "See that small rise there? The drainage in that section is better. That's why we always plant our earliest wheat there. And that low-lying area by the stream? It stays wetter longer, which makes it ideal for barley." This deep knowledge of the land was formed over decades. Every slope, every drainage pattern, every change in soil quality represented information that influenced planting decisions. A good farmer learned to read his land as a scholar reads scrolls, seeing patterns and possibilities that were not obvious to outsiders. Afternoon, the weather shifted. Clouds gathered from the west, hinting at possible rain later in the day. This created a slight dilemma. Rain would be beneficial for the soil, softening it and making work easier. But rain would also delay planting, and the calendar was already getting tight for optimal spring planting. Dionysius decided to finish ploughing this field today, even if it meant working a little longer than usual. This was the kind of decision farmers made dozens of times each season, balancing multiple factors, trying to optimize outcomes while acknowledging that much of what happened was beyond their control. As they resumed work, Callisthenes asked a question that young men have probably asked their farmer parents for millennia. Do you think I should stay on the farm, or should I try something else? Maybe move to the city? Learn a trade? It was a fair question. Farming was hard work with uncertain rewards. City life offered different opportunities. Specialization in a craft, trade, participation in politics, cultural events, and there was no guarantee that the family farm could support another generation at the same standard of living that Dionysius had been able to maintain. However, there was also something to be said for the farming life. The satisfaction of growing food that fed people, the deep connection to the land, the seasons and the natural cycles, the independence that came from producing most of what your family needed to survive. The city needs what we grow here, Dionysius said, after a moment's thought. And we need what the city produces: tools, pottery, cloth, bronze. Neither way of life makes sense without the other. It wasn't quite a direct answer to Callisthenes' question, but it was a perspective worth considering. The relationship between rural and urban life was not competitive. It was complementary. The grain Dionysius grew would feed the craftsmen who made the tools he used. The taxes he paid would support the soldiers who defended his land. The surplus he sold would buy manufactured goods that made his family's life more comfortable. By evening, the field was fully ploughed and ready for planting. Tomorrow, if the weather permitted, they would begin the meticulous work of sowing the seeds, walking up and down the furrows, scattering the grain by hand at a rate calculated for maximum germination and yield. As he gathered and stowed his tools, Dionysius reflected on another successful day of preparing for next year's harvest. The work never ended. There was always something that needed attention, some aspect of the farming operations that could be improved, some new problem to solve. But there was also deep satisfaction in this ancient partnership between human effort and natural abundance. The wheat and barley that would grow in this field would become bread in cities throughout the Greek world. It would sustain families, communities, provide for the complex civilization that produced art, philosophy, and drama. All of it began here, with the soil and the seeds and the patient work of people who understood how to coax food from the earth. What is it like to spend your days engaged in such fundamental work, upon whose success entire civilizations depend, yet so humble that history rarely remembers your name? The fate of the grain grown in Dionysius's generous fields was predetermined. It was destined to travel beyond Greece aboard ships propelled by the might of men like Lysander. For the past 4 years of his life, this man had devoted himself to rowing in the Athenian navy. Now, at the close of a quiet Aegean morning, just as dawn broke, Lysander took his place among the 170 oarsmen, seated on the wooden benches of a trireme, patiently awaiting the signal that would herald the start of another day of grueling training exercises. Lysander was 26 years old, and his roots lay in a small fishing village nestled on the coast of Attica. He joined the fleet not out of a fervent desire for adventure or a thirst for glory, but rather for pragmatic reasons. Military service offered better compensation than his usual fishing livelihood, and opened up opportunities for advancement that were utterly unavailable in his home village. Naval service, as it turned out, exceeded his expectations in terms of interest, though it proved significantly more demanding physically and morally. The vessel on which he served was named the Salaminia, and was a true triumph of engineering and shipbuilding. At 120 feet long, it was designed for exceptional speed and maneuverability, not for carrying heavy cargo. The ship's sleek and narrow hull was carefully calculated to efficiently cut through the water with the synchronized efforts of all its numerous oarsmen. Above the rowing deck were places for marines and officers, where their weapons and equipment were stored. But the true heart of the ship beat right here, in the oarsman's compartment, where men like Lysander generated the power that made everything else possible. His position on the ship was among the middle-level oarsmen. It was not the most prestigious, but far from the most difficult assignment. The top-level oarsmen, known as thranites, received slightly higher pay because their oars were longer and therefore required more effort to manage. The lower-level oarsmen, known as thalamites, worked in more cramped conditions and were constantly exposed to incidental sea spray when the ship gained high speed. Lysander's oar was about 13 feet long, its blade carefully shaped and balanced for maximum efficiency. After 4 years of daily practice, he knew perfectly how it should feel in his hands. The weight distribution, the resistance encountered when submerged in water, and the subtle vibrations that unerringly told him whether he was rowing in perfect synchronization with the rest of the crew. Next to him sat Proclus, a seasoned veteran of 7 years of naval service, who had become a kind of mentor to the younger oarsmen. Proclus had experience in actual battles, having fought Spartan ships during border conflicts, and his stories gave the rest of the crew the most vivid insight into what naval warfare was truly like. What people don't realize about ship-to-ship combat, Proclus had remarked yesterday during their break, is how much it depends on rowing. All the weapons in the world won't help you if you can't maneuver your ship into the right position, and positioning is entirely up to us. This was a truth Lysander had gradually come to understand during his time in the Navy. From the outside, a trireme might seem like a warship incidentally powered by oars, but from the inside, it was more accurate to view it as a high-precision rowing machine that incidentally carried weapons. Everything else, the bronze ram at the bow, the marines with their spears and shields, the tactical genius of the officers, mattered only if the oarsman could put the ship exactly where it needed to be at the most critical moment. Today's exercise involved practicing complex maneuvers that made trireme warfare so demanding. They would work on the diekplaus, a technique where the ship aimed to break through the enemy line and ram it from the side. They would practice the periplus, a flanking maneuver requiring perfect coordination between multiple ships, and they would hone the basic but crucially important skill of moving rapidly backward to avoid enemy ramming attacks. The Keleusts, the rowing master who set the pace and gave commands, signaled the start. "Oars," he shouted loudly, and 170 oar blades simultaneously cut through the water. The sound was distinct, something you never quite got used to. The splash of blades entering the water, the creak of oar handles against leather. Thole-pins, the rhythmic grunting of the oarsmen from exertion. Ready, pull, and they moved. The ship smoothly accelerated as all these individual efforts combined into powerful forward motion. Lysander felt the familiar burn in his shoulders and back as he settled into the rhythm. Rowing a trireme was not the same as rowing a small boat. The resistance was immense, and maintaining battle speed required constant effort from every man aboard. But there was also something deeply satisfying in this work. When everything went well, when all the oarsmen were perfectly synchronized, the ship seemed to glide over the water with an almost supernatural grace. You could feel the hull lift slightly as it gained speed, cutting through the waves with minimal resistance. In such moments, Lysander understood why some men spent their entire careers in the Navy. The first morning exercise involved practicing quick stops and starts. These sudden changes in motion could mean the difference between victory and defeat in actual combat. "Oars aboard!" the Calustes shouted, and immediately all the oarsmen lifted their blades from the water and held them horizontally. The ship continued to glide forward, but without the pull of the oars, it began to slow down. "Back!" came the next command, and now all the oars plunged back into the water, but pulled in the opposite direction. This was one of the most physically demanding actions a trireme crew could perform. They were not only working against the ship's inertia, but also fighting the natural resistance of the water. Lysander gritted his teeth and pulled with all his might, feeling the ship shudder, resisting its own motion. For a few seconds, the Salaminia came to a complete stop. A few more seconds and it actually moved backward. It was an impressive demonstration of what human strength could achieve when properly organized and directed. Between exercises, during short breaks, the oarsmen conversed quietly among themselves. The conversations were a mix of technical discussions, personal news, and speculation about where their next assignment might take them. Someone had heard a rumor that they would be escorting a grain convoy from Egypt. Someone else believed they would be part of a show of force in the waters near Corinth. Lysander found these conversations surprisingly comforting. These men came from all over Attica and beyond, fishermen, farmers, craftsmen, laborers. But naval service had created a common bond between them. They shared the same daily routines, the same physical hardships, the same pride in mastering a complex and important skill. The diversity of their backgrounds actually subtly strengthened the team. Proclus, for example, thanks to his years of fishing, had an excellent knowledge of weather conditions. Darren, who sat 2 benches ahead, had worked as a carpenter before joining the fleet and possessed valuable knowledge about wood and its maintenance. Hippus had grown up on a farm and had the kind of endurance that comes from many years of hard agricultural labor. Around midday, they practiced the most complex maneuver in their repertoire, a coordinated attack involving 3 ships working together. The Salaminia and 2 other triremes would approach an imaginary enemy vessel from different angles, forcing it to choose which threat to respond to, and leaving it vulnerable to attack from other directions. Such tactical coordination required not only the skill of individual crews, but also impeccable communication and cohesion between ships. Flag signals, trumpet calls, and precise execution of predetermined movements, everything had to work perfectly. When everything goes right, it is like a carefully choreographed dance, performed by ships weighing 40 tons each. When everything goes wrong, as it did during their second attempt this morning, the ships could come dangerously close to each other. Oars could tangle, and the entire formation could collapse into confusion. It was a humbling reminder of how much practice it took to master trireme warfare. But they kept working at it, performing the same maneuver again and again until coordination became second nature. This was what naval training was really about. Not just building physical strength and endurance, though that was important, but developing the kind of automatic, instinctive teamwork that would function even under the stress of real combat. By the end of the day, as the training concluded and they returned to port, Lysander was utterly exhausted. His hands were covered in blisters despite the calluses he had built up over years of rowing. His back and shoulders ached in a way that would probably get worse before it got better. His throat was dry from the salt spray and the effort of maintaining the breathing rhythm that heavy rowing demanded, but he also felt a deep satisfaction from the day's work. The crew had performed well, constantly improving their execution of complex maneuvers. The ship responded beautifully to their efforts, once again demonstrating the remarkable engineering that made trireme warfare possible. And there was something deeply satisfying in being part of a team where every individual's contribution was vital and noticeable. As he approached the harbour of Piraeus, Lysander observed a line of other warships returning from intense training. The sight of numerous triremes, majestically moving in formation, was truly awe-inspiring. It was a living, tangible demonstration of Athens' undeniable naval power, a force that convincingly explained how this city-state had managed to establish itself as the dominant power throughout the Aegean Sea. Tonight, Lysander would head to his modest home, located near the harbour, to share dinner with his wife and young daughter, and then give his aching muscles a well-deserved rest. Tomorrow he would again step aboard his ship to repeat it all. This, of course, was not the brilliant and heroic life about which poets composed their songs, but it was honest and worthy labour, serving an extremely important purpose. One can only imagine what it is like to be part of a grand machine daily, woven from human bodies and wooden oars, where every individual effort merges to become an integral part of something incomparably larger and more powerful than oneself. The naval exercises Lysander had just completed required significant financial investment, and payment for them was made in silver coins that passed through the hands of many people, among whom was Euclid. He, a banker, successfully managed his small but invariably prosperous money-changing business, located right in the bustling agora. It is now, on this busy morning in the heart of Athens, that Euclid carefully inspects a handful of drachmas that a merchant from Aegina wishes to exchange.